Autumn 1957 introduced a new sound to the world, a steady pulse that crackled through shortwave sets and evening bulletins. The beeps carried no words, yet they changed the vocabulary of power. Headlines grew large, photographs of the night sky appeared on front pages, and officials in many capitals stayed late behind closed doors. Maps were spread across desks, calendars were marked, and priorities shifted. Teachers told students to watch the heavens after dinner, a small moving point gliding over rooftops before vanishing into darkness. The first days felt unsettled. Was this only a scientific milestone or something that touched on security and status? In Washington and Moscow, aides prepared summaries for leaders, and caution colored every phrase. The record shows public statements that praised discovery while holding back on detail, and private notes that suggested urgency. The sequence of events that followed would move in steps: a response drafted, a reply announced, a new target set. This program is a crafted reconstruction for storytelling based on open historical references, archived newspapers, radio transcripts, and public speeches. It is speculative in tone, but anchored to widely known timelines. Names of devices and exact procedures are avoided to keep focus on atmosphere, setting, and choices under pressure. What you will hear is not a verdict, but a plausible narrative of how the era might have sounded in offices, classrooms, and living rooms. We remain in the period itself, and we do not leap ahead. The distance between claim and reality is noted with care, and the scenes prefer restraint over drama. Our path begins with a signal in the sky and a move step by step toward a footprint far from home. The first orbiting signal arrived without fanfare inside most homes, yet few weeks in the 20th century would carry such weight. In October 1957, a small sphere circled above, and the world learned to listen. Radios captured the ticking rhythm. Newspaper columns explained the track across the night and printed small charts so readers could look up at the right hour. In city parks, families pointed and guessed. In government buildings, the mood was taut. Analysts compared launch sites, distances, and schedules. The language of announcements was careful. One side spoke of progress for humanity. The other side acknowledged the achievement while noting that strategy might now include the sky. School boards revised science lessons, adding extra sessions after the last bell. The next launch, only weeks later, reinforced the message that the heavens could host man-made objects for more than a single pass. Even if the technical meaning remained obscure to many, the symbolism was direct. A new arena had opened. In Washington, committees formed and rosters of experts grew. Memos requested more instructors, more laboratories, and a tighter calendar for testing. Some notes from advisory meetings indicate concern about pace and priority, though the language was often moderate. Across the Atlantic, Allied governments sought briefings couched in cautious terms. A new term, space race, began to appear in editorials, first as a loose metaphor, then as a concrete description of a contest that would test endurance, not a single moment. The early American response mixed ambition with visible setback. Fueling the mood were public launches that did not always go to plan. Evening news programs kept a measured tone, yet the subtext was plain. Catching up would require organization rather than slogans. The first successful United States satellite in early 1958 steadied nerves. The sense of crisis softened into resolve. A series of steps followed. A civilian agency formed to coordinate missions, educational campaigns promoted science as a path of service, and public lectures filled town halls. In the Soviet Union, coverage celebrated progress as a national project, with parades that framed the new age as a people's endeavor. Outside that sphere, analysts read lines and silences, trying to discern intentions that official language did not reveal. Two types of public indicators shaped the mood in these months. Press statements preserved in newspaper archives traced a careful pattern of assurance and ambition. Hearing transcripts from congressional sessions captured the tempo of debate, where urgency met prudence. The measure of success in this early phase was not simply a payload in orbit, but the ability to steer public expectations toward patience. By late 1958, the outlines of the competition were visible. Each side would announce, the other would answer. Each school year would begin with new charts and classroom posters. The pace was steady, not frantic. Leaders avoided grand forecasts, yet the direction was unmistakable. The sky had turned into a ledger of national claims, tallied at dawn and dusk. Inside laboratories, long shifts accumulated and calendars ran tight. Yet the narration of daily life did not vanish. Children still biked to school, radios still played music between news bulletins, and most households saw the space race through a small screen or a headline font. The era felt practical rather than glamorous. People learned that a countdown might stop and start, that weather could delay the show, and that achievement often arrived after several tries. The chapter closed its first turn when American programs began to plan for human flight. Training centers expanded. Strict routines were established, quiet and repetitive, and often invisible to the public eye. Visiting journalists were offered tours that revealed little, but enough to calm headlines. What had begun as a shock was now a schedule. The sense of being behind the curve had not entirely faded, but a rhythm had taken hold. The bridge to the next phase formed as both sides prepared to place a person in orbit. And our scene moves toward briefings in early 1961, where launch windows, weather, and broadcast plans sat side by side on the same table. The spring of 1961 altered the public understanding of space. A short flight around the planet completed by a single figure produced images and statements that traveled far beyond the launch site. The announcement arrived with crisp timing, and within hours the story looped across radio and television. Crowds in one capital filled broad avenues. Speeches described a human boundary crossed with courage and clarity. In other capitals, the tone was restrained but alert. Advisors hurried into offices carrying folders that combined press summaries with technical notes, written in plain language for senior readers. The contrast between celebration and analysis framed the following weeks. In classrooms, children drew the arc of the orbit on chalkboards. Families kept evening appointments with the sky, still looking for a moving point, as the coverage explained how one orbit could be seen and another not, depending on location and hour. Within the United States, officials faced two tasks at once. First, they had to explain that human flight remained a plan, not a distant dream. Second, they had to convince the public that the plan could still lead. A series of brief announcements shaped the narrative. Training was underway. Safety would not be rushed. Confidence remained strong. The first American crewed flights soon followed. They were shorter at the start, yet they mattered for morale. Each success was treated as both a technical step and a sign that pace, not headlines, would set the course. Newsreels presented the pilots as disciplined professionals. The tone was modest. The message suggested steadiness after a period of uncertainty. Internationally, the presence of a person above the Earth changed the stakes. If a living passenger could circle the planet and return intact, then distance and altitude were no longer abstract values. They were stages to be climbed with care. Skeptical voices, often off record, wondered whether the contest would shift from circles to destinations. Official language did not go that far, but a sense of direction began to form. A small number of indicators from this moment appear in public archives. One set of press releases, held in various newspaper collections, reveal how phrasing grew more confident after each safe return. Another set of cabinet meeting summaries, released years later, suggest cautious discussion of larger goals, couched in broad terms to avoid binding commitments. Across the Soviet Union, newspapers maintained a theme of national achievement in service of learning. The photographs were large. The text stressed discipline. Abroad, editors mixed admiration with guarded prose about strategic meaning. The difference in tone mattered. It hinted at divergent aims that could not be spelled out without inviting escalation. In American cities and small towns, ceremonies honored the new pilots. Parades were brisk and simple, heavy on flags and smiles, light on theory. Schools introduced morning recitations that included a note on the most recent flight. In living rooms, maps were pinned to walls and marked with pencil lines that curved from west to east. Still, the program avoided making the contest sound like a march toward a single promise. The words were careful, even when the mood was proud. Meanwhile, planning teams expanded. Schedules grew denser. Extended missions were sketched. Practice would soon involve longer stays, more complex maneuvers, and the careful study of how people fared during hours rather than minutes in weightlessness. The public did not see much of this preparation. Its evidence appeared as small notices about construction near coastal launch sites, new dormitories at training centers, and the steady stream of quiet, daytime tests that drew little audience. If the first orbits had reshaped expectations, the next task would be to learn how to work above the Earth for more than a brief visit. That change in scope marked a shift in the rhythm of the race. Applause would be less about firsts and more about endurance and coordination. Our narration moves forward to mid-decade planning rooms where charts track rendezvous attempts, extended stays, and the modest language of readiness that points toward a larger target without declaring it outright. By the middle of the 1960s, the contest had acquired a more deliberate cadence. Short flights gave way to missions measured in many orbits. The emphasis moved from proof to practice. Crews trained to meet in space and to stay aloft long enough to learn routine behaviors. Newspapers reported on link-ups, a term that sounded simple but required careful preparation on the ground and precise actions in flight. Another theme entered the coverage: stepping outside the vehicle. The first time a person operated in open space, it reinforced a simple idea for the public. People could act, not only ride, beyond the atmosphere. The visual record, still images replayed on evening programs, had a quiet, methodical look. No grand theatrics, only steady motion, tethers, handholds, and the clock. In this period, the United States began to reduce the early gap. The stream of missions was regular and purposeful. Schedules were tight, contingencies were plain, and the press tone shifted from anxious to workmanlike. The Soviet program continued to post significant achievements, and coverage at home retained the language of national progress. Yet outside observers noticed fewer public details with each passing year and grew careful about interpreting hints. In America, one speech from 1961 had already set a direction that seemed ambitious, even when read without emotion. A landing on the moon within the decade was now a benchmark, not a slogan. Mid-decade operations would test whether the pieces could fit. Extended stays examined sleep, attention, and the simple question of how a team holds a schedule in a small cabin. Meetings at mission control centers refined procedures and condensed checklists into clear sequences. On the diplomatic front, messaging remained balanced. Leaders praised science and stressed peaceful aims, while allowing the public to understand that prestige came attached. Even in this more sober phase, clear indicators of priority appeared. Budget hearings preserved in legislative records show line items that grew in concert with the push for longer missions. Public affairs briefings, archived by several agencies, describe goals in broad terms and emphasize the need for reliability. Factories responded with longer shifts, new suppliers, and tighter inspection lines. Universities added courses that fed trained staff into the program. Towns near launch sites expanded to accommodate families who served in roles that were rarely visible yet essential. The audience at home felt the change in scale. Launches still drew attention, yet they now formed a sequence rather than isolated events. Children kept scrapbooks. Teens wrote essays about the moon as a place one might approach in their lifetime. Television programs learned to pace updates for missions that lasted days rather than minutes, rotating between weather, sports, and the latest note from orbit. Failures and near misses occurred, as they must in any complex effort, but officials treated them with a restrained seriousness that neither hid problems nor invited panic. Each setback led to pauses, revisions, and a return to flight. The music of the era, brass bands, simple jingles, and the drone of launch commentary became part of the domestic soundscape. Behind the scenes, the rationale for the moon as an objective was discussed in several registers. One was scientific curiosity framed in clean language that avoided speculation. Another was national demonstration, mentioned with care in official documents and more freely in op-eds. The presence of both aims shaped decisions about pace and publicity. The program learned to present itself as educational and open, while maintaining the privacy needed for safe operations. By late 1966, the idea that a crew could travel, meet, and return with predictability was no longer contested. What remained was scale. Could larger vehicles be prepared on a schedule? Could launch windows, weather, and training converge often enough to attempt the long crossing? Men and women who worked in procurement and logistics carried as much weight as those in flight suits. Their schedules, too, were unforgiving. The language of national briefings grew more concrete as checkouts and dress rehearsals accumulated. The public heard of stages, test series, and final reviews, plain terms that conveyed gravity without edge. The Soviet side, still proud and capable, kept its cards close. Observers pieced together intentions from parade displays, brief speeches, and the tempo of official photographs. The race had matured into a test of systems. It no longer relied on surprise. It demanded consistency. In the final sentences of this segment, we hold our focus on the preparation halls where checklists are signed. Flags hang in quiet rows, and calendars show a narrow margin for error. And we now move to factories and control rooms, where the moon is treated as a scheduled objective rather than a distant dream. Factories in 1967 sounded like long, steady shifts tied to a calendar that did not forgive mistakes, and the pressure to integrate many parts into a single path was evident in every corridor. Engineers and planners moved between checklists and briefings, careful to keep language grounded and simple. The goal was clear in public, yet the steps remained deliberately plain in official phrasing. Then came a loss that forced a pause. A training accident during a ground exercise cost lives and changed the tone across the program. News bulletins treated the event with restraint, and statements from officials expressed sorrow and a renewed emphasis on method. The public mood shifted from excitement to sober patience. Review boards convened and issued recommendations written in measured prose. The system absorbed the lessons. Schedules were rewritten, and the word safety began to appear more often in briefings. Crews returned to training with a seriousness that reached beyond ceremony. The United States kept its stated aim, but the path would now include a deeper culture of testing and verification. On the Soviet side, the record remained guarded. Announcements celebrated national strengths, and photographs showed confident faces. But outsiders sensed internal debates not captured on the page. In America, congressional hearings recorded careful exchanges about priorities, resources, and risks, offering one of the few public indicators of how decisions were taken in that year. Those transcripts, still available in legislative records, showed a program answering to elected oversight with calm replies and specific commitments. Another indicator came from press conferences at space centers, where officials described progress in plain terms and avoided grand forecasts. The next flights would demonstrate coordination and endurance, not only hardware. During 1968, the plan regained tempo. Uncrewed tests demonstrated stability and rhythm. Crewed missions returned to orbit for extended practice, turning textbook concepts into routine behavior. Rendezvous sequences improved. Long shifts in control rooms became normal again. The message to the public was spare and persistent. Procedures had been rewritten and rehearsed. Confidence would come from repetition. The year ended with a decision that felt both ambitious and controlled. A crew would travel around the moon without landing to measure navigation, communication, and the cadence of long-distance operations. The winter broadcast from lunar distance reached homes across many countries. The images and the steady voices carried a feeling of competence rather than spectacle. The effect on public perception was immediate. The moon moved closer in the mind because teams on the ground treated the crossing as a scheduled task. In classrooms, teachers noted the date on the chalkboard and allowed students a few minutes to listen. In offices, staff gathered around small sets during breaks. The rivalry did not vanish, but it seemed to find a new register. One side had created a corridor through which a landing might pass if all continued to align. The Soviet program still held cards near the chest, and foreign observers, reading newspapers and watching parade footage, tried to infer intent from sparse hints. Meanwhile, American factories increased throughput and inspection rates. Training centers ran tight routines that emphasized restraint and clarity. The next step would demand coordination across thousands of actions, each attached to a clock. Supervisors asked for precise wording in briefings, and public affairs teams adapted to a quieter voice. Applause would wait for results. The sequence became the story. The distance to the goal could now be measured by the number of rehearsals that remained, not by slogans. The nation watched without fanfare as each intermediate flight closed another gap. The memory of 1967 stayed near at hand and influenced every decision. Plans allowed for margins and for several kinds of delay. The calendar still aimed at the decade's end, but officials avoided repeating the target in every sentence. They let the work carry the message. A landing attempt was no longer a question of concept. It was a question of timing, discipline, and the capacity to hold steady when small surprises appeared. Outside the space centers, daily life moved on. Newspapers ran sports on the same page as launch notes. Television charters divided schedules between weather, local reports, and capsule updates. In short, the extraordinary blended with the ordinary. That was the sign of maturity in the program. The era had shifted from first to follow-through. In this climate, the bridge to the next segment opens on spring 1969. With rehearsal flights complete, press bulletins prepared, and control rooms drafting the exact sequence that would govern an attempt to place a crew on the lunar surface. Spring and early summer 1969 introduced a different rhythm to the public ear, one built around short, firm phrases and daily readiness notes that made the coming attempt feel both near and controlled. In the months before the launch window, the people closest to the work spoke little outside official settings. Training blocks remained strict. Schedulers rehearsed contingencies. Public briefings reduced complex preparations into familiar, non-technical language. The tone of the country did not tilt to pageantry. It settled into a practical patience shaped by repeated evidence that the necessary steps had been practiced. News editors adapted to the quiet. Stories were placed next to routine items and written without excess. The message was simple. The attempt would proceed if the weather allowed and if checks stayed green. Across the ocean, Soviet outlets maintained their standard voice, noting American plans with a steady calm while underscoring their own program's values. Foreign correspondents filed cautious dispatches from Florida hotels, describing crowds that were modest in size and respectful of limits. Inside the United States, two public indicators signaled the final phase. First, press briefings distributed on the eve of launch outlined the sequence in accessible terms, and their phrasing, archived in newsrooms, showed how officials managed expectations without inviting fear. Second, flight plans entered the legislative and administrative record in the form of scheduled releases, time-stamped and methodical, which told the audience when to expect movement or silence. At home, families adjusted routines around the likely launch day. Some schools planned to roll a television cart into assembly halls. Stores sold small posters with maps and timelines. Yet, even in this narrow window, the program avoided promising history. It emphasized procedure and readiness. The decision framework was presented as conditional. If a condition was not met, the attempt would hold. That approach built credibility. It made any eventual success feel earned, not contrived. In control rooms, different teams walked through the final hours again and again. There were no public scripts for stress, only the disciplined silence of professionals following known steps. The men and women in support roles took meals at odd hours and slept in short blocks, their clocks aligned to the planned sequence. The country kept its tone level. The focus was on doing things in order. When the launch day arrived, the morning felt crisp on the coast. Crowds gathered at safe distances. Broadcasters spoke in measured cadence. The countdown moved without drama, and engines lit the sky with a controlled force that came across on television as a bright column rising against the horizon. People clapped, then listened. The climb ended with a clean separation. The mission entered the next stage. Over the following days, the mood of the nation balanced two forces. Pride felt natural, but restraint remained. The nation had learned from earlier pauses that timing matters more than tone. Journalists used tight sentences and avoided large claims. Families tracked progress on printed diagrams. The crew's communications were steady and brief, the sort of speech that gives confidence by refusing excess. The Soviet press maintained its course, and official voices there did not mock or praise. They observed. The space age had matured to include silent watching as a form of participation. While the spacecraft closed the final distance, the story at home became one of waiting and pacing. People took normal shifts and tuned in when reports were due. The attempt would live in small updates rather than big scenes until the moment of descent. If it came, that moment would require focus, not narration. America's messaging stayed oriented toward craft. The idea that this effort might belong to science, prestige, and public morale in equal parts remained present but unspoken. The language of officials kept its lines clean and short. Weather, timing, and system status would govern the decision. No one promised spectacle. They promised effort. On the night before the scheduled landing, many households placed radios near kitchen tables and tested their volumes. Apartment windows glowed in quiet blocks. People checked the time and slept in short segments. Morning would carry routine chores. Afternoon or evening, depending on the zone, would bring an attempt at the surface. Our path continues from this steady posture into the final approach, where descent, landing, and the first hours on the surface are handled with the same measured voice that carried the nation through the countdown. The descent began as an exercise in calm language, and the country held its breath while control rooms executed a series of steps that had been rehearsed until they felt ordinary. Television carried commentators who respected the silence when numbers mattered, then resumed when it was safe to explain what had occurred. The landing, when confirmed, did not explode into frenzy. It opened a long exhale across homes, offices, and public halls. People raised their hands, clapped, and then went quiet again, waiting for the next signal. The first minutes on the surface were shaped by protocols that translated well to living rooms. Movement was careful. Words were few. The scene contained no decoration. It was work carried out in a place without air and presented without flourish. The sense of scale arrived slowly as families realized that the frame included another world. In the Soviet Union, official coverage was minimal at first. Later summaries were brief and formal, acknowledging achievement without heavy comment. Across Europe, the news occupied front pages and half-hour blocks on evening programs, delivered in a register that credited planning and persistence rather than surprise. Back in the United States, the official voice held steady. Press materials, prepared in advance, framed the event as the completion of a national challenge set earlier in the decade. They suggested that the work had been worthwhile, but avoided declaring final meaning. Two dependable indicators of the moment entered the public record. One was the printed transcript of mission communications released shortly after the event, a document that delivered a clear sequence in plain speech and has since been quoted in classrooms and libraries. The other was the briefing to legislators, logged in administrative files that summarized outcomes and next steps using precise, even sentences. Together they formed a durable account that matched the measured tone the country had practiced. The world saw images that translated into many languages without difficulty. There were people on the surface and people listening far away. The connection felt simple because the language stayed simple. During the hours that followed, tasks continued according to plan. Tools were handled, notes were made. The coverage did not attempt to give every movement a metaphor. It kept to the facts. In cafes and airports, strangers shared screens and nodded. Telephone lines filled with short calls. The age of distant travel had crossed a boundary visible to ordinary life. The return began with the same quiet focus. The landing at home waters carried relief and modest celebration. The crew entered a period of isolation as a precaution, and officials described the reasons in brief statements. The country received the crew with due ceremony, but also with a restraint that made sense after a decade of learned patience. In the Soviet Union, the tone stayed even, and public attention returned to domestic priorities, while analysts abroad read the silences for clues. The wider contest did not end that day, but its frame had changed. One side had met a declared goal within the stated time. The other had charted a different course, less visible to an outside audience. Both still carried ambitions that would be expressed in later plans. For now, the record shows an achievement presented without swagger and a global audience that answered with respect. The voice of the era did not declare a final chapter. It shaped a corridor for further work. In our closing transition, the scene narrows to post-flight reports, press questions, and new schedules penciled into wall calendars as planners consider what, if anything, should follow a footprint and a distant flag. The months after the landing felt disciplined rather than triumphant. Offices processed reports, updated procedures, and reviewed the timestamps that had led from ignition to recovery. Public speeches thanked teams without making promises that could not be kept. The country had learned how to hold applause and ask for the next plan in plain words. Overseas, the topic moved into calmer columns, owning an accepted place in the news cycle. The two programs still carried momentum, but expressed it with different levels of openness. Analysts parsed public documents, and the record they left was tidy. Mission transcripts confirmed a steady cadence for each phase. Legislative notes captured briefings that included outcomes and modest next steps. Between those sources, a picture formed of an effort completed with care and presented without exaggeration. It suggested that prestige and exploration could share one stage, each shaping the other. The story does not end here because the decade did not end at once. Crews trained, managers drafted new lists, and cities adjusted to a future in which such attempts might repeat. The broadcast that had once felt unimaginable now belonged to the living memory of a single season. The rivalry remained, yet the tone had softened into technique. What seemed radical in 1957 had become a series of tasks that a nation could schedule and a world could follow. The line between boldness and routine had shifted in a way that surprised even careful observers. The frontier did not close, it simply became a workplace that demanded patience. Where would that patience lead? Would resources continue to match ambition? Could public attention hold for another sequence of long, careful steps? The next chapter turns on those questions and on the quiet work of planners reviewing calendars, press officers drafting restrained bulletins, and crews repeating checklists that point beyond the first landing toward whatever the next sober milestone might be.